Today we're talking about the history of interior design in the second edition by Jeannie Ireland. This is Chapter 2, Ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian Design. Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations were located in warm climates where the land was relatively flat. You can see here in the map that Mesopotamia is located at the head of the Persian Gulf, and the region stretched really far all the way to the foothills of Persia, over to the west of Syria, and down towards the Arabian Desert. We can also see Egypt located over on the left-hand side of the map. This is located in the upper east corner of Africa. Today, it's one of the most populated countries in Africa and contains major waterways like the Nile River. It, of course, contained the Nile River then and is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And it contains one of the major deserts, the Sahara Desert. Rainfall was limited during this time period, and so connection to these waterways were very important, although periodically they would flood, and that would also introduce new challenges for these cultures. The pyramids of Giza were the biggest Egyptian pyramid and is the tomb of the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu. It was built in the early 20th, 6th century BC during a period of around 27 years. And the pyramid is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and the only one to remain largely intact. As part of the Giza pyramid complex, it borders present-day Giza in Egypt. Mesopotamia is one of the earliest civilizations that developed. It's considered the birthplace of writing, and with it, the recorded history. Its people also built the world's first cities and developed the oldest known political and administrative systems. This is mostly centered in what is now Iraq. The people that we connect to the Mesopotamian region are the Sumerians and Babylonians, as well as others, but these were the most influential or recognized from that time period. Gods were influential, and gods usually were identified with natural phenomenon, including storms, lightning, and again, they believed that they were more powerful than humans and were immortal. In the Mesopotamian region, the Hanging Gardens are also one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Early Mesopotamians carved low-relief figures in stone and in adobe brick. In paintings from this time period, figures were represented depicting their heads and legs in profile and with their shoulders and eyes shown frontally. The artists of this time did not use perspective, but instead overlapped figures to create a sense of depth. Tile work and inlay work is found from this time period. Artisans were skilled in inlay work using something called lapis lazuli, which is a blue stone, limestone, and also included other materials. Animals and mythical creatures are seen in some of the depictions in the artwork. Oftentimes motifs were derived either from nature or included many geometric forms like zigzags and chevrons. Because the southern part of this region lacked good building stone, it typically was reserved for carving reliefs. Most buildings were constructed of adobe brick or other methods. they did figure out how to incorporate load-bearing construction, which would mean that each part of the wall supported the weight above it. Because there was a lack of wood for fuel, fired brick was expensive and was used sparingly throughout. Instead, they might use reed to create reed structures, similar to what you see here. Wattle and daub construction is basically where they would spread mud over reeds or mud over interwoven rushes. They would also use that mud to create bricks, and they would set them in the sun to sun dry, or if they had access to wood, they would fire them. The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar showed the first urban planning with raised, paved processional ways, or dromos, which is what we kind of know as an avenue. Impactful things that we know come from the Mesopotamian region are fired brick, the development of the arch and vault, as well as ziggurats. A ziggurat is a massive structure that has the form of a terraced compound with receding stories or levels above, like stepped upper portions. Recognizable Mesopotamian architectural characteristics include adobe brick construction with some use of fired brick or stone, the inclusion of glazed brick and tile, surfaces covered with relief sculptures, sculpted anthropomorphic figures used as guardians at the gates of the ziggurats, monumental stairways and gateways, walls surrounding cities, temples, and palaces, as well as alternating projections and recesses along walls. Keep in mind, anthropomorphic forms are common and combined an animal with a human head or a human body with an animal head. Ancient furniture was made of many different materials, including reeds, wood, stone, metals, straw, and ivory. They could be decorated in many different ways, sometimes even covered with upholstery. The tables of the Mesopotamian region could be decorated with expensive metals. Chairs would even be padded with felt, rushes, and upholstery, and even have some metal inlay work. It was uncommon for most houses to have a lot of furniture, as most furniture was reserved for the wealthy. The majority of furniture in Sumeria was made of wicker wood. Because perishable materials were commonly used for Sumerian furniture, it's difficult to find much of this furniture left intact. Few sources consist of artifacts that they were able to gain through conquests. Most of this is found through depicted images. Because the Babylonians did not put furniture in tombs, there were very few things found from this region. Again, mostly depictions found on drinking vessels and jewelry, as those were the only things typically included in tombs. Mesopotamian interiors, floors were often made of compressed earth. Sometimes stone might be incorporated. The walls were often divided into three parts, similar to what you see here, with the lower portion including or called the dado, which included relief carvings. Frescoes covered all of the walls in general. The upper portion of the wall is known as the frieze, and the middle portion, the main field. Ancient Egypt is located in the upper east corner of Africa. This civilization was able to thrive because of the Nile River. The Nile River still runs through Egypt today and has been around since before 3200 BC. This is what allowed the ancient Egyptians to develop and expand its civilization and artistic expression. The Nile River was critical in these ancient times. They did not just use it for transportation for people, but also for building materials. They were allowed and able to use this to communicate and trade with other regions as well. One of the biggest imports to this region was timber. Because of the type of wood that could grow in Egypt, it wasn't suitable for making furniture. The local vegetation that was grown was their inspiration for decorative schemes in the architecture and furniture, as well as often implied symbolism for something else. The most commonly used materials for home buildings was mud from the Nile, because there was a lot of it around and it was easy to use without advanced tools. Pharaohs were the rulers of this time, and Egyptian kingship under the pharaoh were based on divine right. Pharaohs would own the land, and peasants were attached to the land and would do the majority of the harvesting. Egyptians believed that the gods impacted almost everything in their daily life, including harvests, and so they would pray to specific gods as they believed they were related to the different aspects of society. Animals were often depicted as certain deities. For the 3,000 years that ancient Egypt thrived, experts estimate that more than 170 pharaohs ruled. The people believed that pharaohs were gods on earth, and that they were responsible for ruling and in the care of the people that lived on the land. Well-known pharaohs include King Tut or Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, and Ramses II. The lifestyles of the ancient Egyptians were very involved in their polytheistic religion. Polytheistic or polytheism means that they believed in many gods. They had temples that were devoted to their different gods and built shrines everywhere. The religion played a major role in their recreational and leisure activities. Ancient Egypt was an early civilization that also required their civilians to pay taxes. They also had a high regard for children and spouses. Women were free to vote at this time and testify in court, but they also were instrumental in raising the family and taking care of the home. Marriages were polygamous, meaning that the husbands could have more than one wife and often would have children with each wives or each of their wives. Because religion was so impactful, the art served their religion, and most craft schools were attached to temples, so deviation from standard forms was unlikely, which is why we see repetitive images and shapes throughout. In the future, several time periods are influenced by the Egyptians. In France, Napoleon is influential during what is known as the Empire movement of the late French neoclassic, which is in the 1800s. Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France in 1804, hence the name of the movement Empire Style, which glorifies ancient Egyptian and Roman decorative motifs. In England, ancient cultures influenced ornamental detail greatly because of the defeat of Napoleon. This is how the ancient Egyptian culture was spread throughout England. Thomas Sheraton also introduced classical and Egyptian designs throughout England in the late 1790s and early 1800s with his pattern books. This was after Napoleon's defeat. Thomas Hope was another one who celebrated English Regency, and he had a love of ancient decorative motifs and a lot of it was included in his furniture. He had a more archaeologically accurate approach to ornament than Sheraton, because he actually went and studied in Egypt, as well as Turkey, Syria, and Greece, and he designed rooms in his home that were based on specifics from these ancient cultures. Also, future generations were inspired by the Egyptians, especially we'll see them later in the 17 and 1800s. Some of the motifs that we'll see coming up, as well as designs like sphinxes and cartonages, are ones that we'll see also later implemented in historical designs. Symbols in a largely illiterate society serve the vital purpose of relaying the most important information and values of the culture from generation to generation. The peasant farmer would not have been able to read the literature, poetry, hymns, or tell stories about his gods, kings, and history, but could instead look at symbols that were located on temple walls and be able to read them or understand them through the symbols used. Monumental architecture was reserved exclusively for military deities and the dead. Temples and tombs were the most important structures. The Egyptians also determined an important ratio, 1 to 1.618, which is now what we know of as the golden rectangle or the golden rule. For measurement, the Egyptians used cubits, or spans and fingers. The cubit is the measurement from the tip of your longest finger to the bottom of your elbow. Columns were seen at this time. Originally, columns were probably large trunks of trees, but eventually became made out of stone. They were not monolith, but instead were stacked pieces of stone, one on top of the other, to put in place. They often had round shafts and would carve things like hieroglyphics into them. They could be decorative and include fluting or other details. Here we can see a line of sphinx or sphinxes. This is a mythical creature with the head of a human and the body of a lion, and often might have the wings of a falcon. The Egyptian sphinx was viewed as ferocious in strength and often were used as guardians to flank entrances to temples. When thinking about temples, of course, columns come to mind. Originally, column shafts in ancient Egypt were adorned with colorful depictions and carved relief painted, and typically were masterpieces and architectural elements. Originally, the Egyptian columns were monolithic, but later on, as I mentioned, they changed in the use of sectional blocks. During the era from 3050 BC to 900 BC, when the pharaohs ruled Egypt, the earliest builders made columns from large blocks of sandstone, limestone, red granite, and then later stacking stone discs on top of one another was introduced. They're diverse and range from 16-sided polygon to circular columns. Imhotep, the ancient Egyptian architect, was known to carve stone columns resembling bundled reeds and other plants. The columns were placed close to ensure that they could carry the heavy weight of the stone roof beams above. Tent pole columns, constructed of brick, they're stone representations of wooden poles. One of the earliest of Egyptian structures, but their use is questionable in terms of where they've derived from. Plant-style columns were an early form of column and again resembled bundled reeds and plant stems, sometimes made of polygonal shafts. These are some of the most interesting columns in Egypt and were the first stone columns on Earth. They were used in non-secular buildings and rarely in religious architecture. The use of columns started in Egyptian form, as we've seen many different shapes and inspirations from natural beings. Although the Egyptians were inspiration and led to the classical orders that we'll see upcoming in the Greek and Roman eras. We see columns used in many areas of architecture, including outside areas like courtyards, as well as into interiors like cathedrals. Because the afterlife was important to the Egyptians, tombs were built to last for eternity, and it's in these structures that we find most of items that remain intact. We're still in search thousands of years later for uncovered tombs and are able to recover items from these tombs to give us a better understanding of these ancient civilizations. It's in these tombs, especially of the ancient Egyptians, that we're able to have a better understanding through the items that they've included, which include furniture, vessels for food and drink, as well as jewelry and everyday items that they might have in their homes. Pyramids were designed above to help disguise these tombs and often had passageways or false passageways underneath to help disguise and hide these tombs so they would not be disturbed. Here we can see this temple has two major entrances with multiple pylons and rows of sphinxes lining the dromoi. Pyramid tombs were a product of the Old Kingdom. The step pyramid of Zoser was rectangular in plan and more than 400 feet long and 204 feet high. Of course, Egypt is known for and recognized for their pyramids. Ancient Egypt's pyramids are landmarked, recognized around the world. And originally it was believed that these creations were built by Egyptian slaves. It took years and maybe even decades to build each pyramid. They're built from chiseled granite and limestone rock, and it's believed that these rocks were pulled to each of the level of the pyramids by a system of ramps. They could have used wooden hoists to help lift them up and pull the blocks, but that's just a theory. The architectural style of these monuments show that ancient Egyptians' brilliance and technical skills in engineering. For the most part, the pyramids served as a burial for the wealthy and their royalty. The Egyptians believed that the pyramids were able to protect their dead, and they wanted their pharaohs to have a safe journey into the afterlife. The sacred items that will be buried with them for those in power are things that we're able to use to understand them more today. They also serve as a permanent reminder of the ancient Egyptians and their dedication to their gods and their pharaohs. You may have seen things like mummies and been able to recognize those as Egyptian. When Egyptians died, their bodies were usually laid to rest in pits of sand. The conditions would preserve the bodies for hundreds of years since it was dry climate, which was optimal for mummification. Eventually, Egyptians began to make caskets for their dead and embalm the bodies and wrap them in linen. The types of construction created by Egyptians were wattle and daub construction, which is where they would spread mud over reeds or mud over interwoven rushes. They also used mud to create bricks that they would eventually use. They would dry them out by setting them in the sun, or sometimes they would fire them if they had the ability to have wood to create fire. They also would use and incorporate glazed tile. Tiles were found in their temples, funerary structures, as well as in military installations. For construction of buildings, both wood and stone were used in what's called tray-beaten construction. Tray-beaten construction is another word for post and beam, or post and lintel, where the upright or vertical post would support the horizontal beam or horizontal members. The length between the posts would depend on the materials that they would use and the overall tensile strength. For example, stone is very high strength when it's in a vertical position, but it has a very low tensile strength when it's in the beam or horizontal position. So if they're using stone, those posts would be much closer together. That's why, depending upon what type of material we'll see, that the columns or posts in Egyptian architecture might vary. As mentioned, the Egyptians are highly religious, and this was the motivation for their monuments and tomb architecture, similar to what we can see here for this temple that was built for the queen, although she was actually buried elsewhere. Palaces were the residence of the pharaohs and their entourage. They consisted of complex buildings designed to house the headquarters of power and the temples for worshiping their gods. There were two main sections, one to accommodate the needs of the pharaoh and the other to meet the requirements of administration. Climate was a big influence on how Egyptians built. There was minimal rainfall, intense sunlight and heat, and little variation in temperature, so this created an environment suitable for great indoor-outdoor relationship in their buildings. Items often included flat roofs, clerestory windows, which are windows placed high in the wall, porticos or porch structure with columns, loggias, which is a roofed gallery, and then roof ventilation, so this would allow air to flow into the innermost rooms, as well as open courtyards. Egyptian houses differed depending on whether they were located in an urban or rural area. Rural homes typically were a single story and were larger and would incorporate gardens, courtyards, and pools of water. In general, their buildings were built in what's known as a tripartite plan, meaning that it's made up of 3 parts, tri meaning 3. This was both for residences as well as public architecture. In a typical house, the division was the first part was the entrance area or the reception vestibule. The second or receding part would then be a columned central living hall, and the third or furthest part from the entrance would be the bedroom or sleeping chambers. As you moved further from the entrance to the rear of the house, this became accessible to fewer and fewer people and was considered the most or more private areas, similar to how we create privacy today. Classes were recognized by the size of house, material used, and overall decor. All of the previous mentioned items influenced the ancient designs, including the Nile River, the vegetation, technology, construction techniques, climate, religion, and social hierarchy. Clay plaster, gypsum plaster, whiting plaster, all of these were used to prepare walls for decorative mural paintings. Gypsum plaster was used in 3 ways. It was used to coat the walls that had been clay plastered. It was used to cover or level defects in the walls, and it was also used for surface irregularities that were created if it was necessary to create specific reliefs for the decor. Limestone was the most prevalent stone in Egypt and was also used for mural painting. Fresco, the type of painting done by Egyptians where the paint's applied to wet plaster instead of waiting for the plaster to dry. Floors were made of mud plaster or mud brick from the Nile River. Liquid gypsum concrete was poured, and stone could also be used for the floor. Decorative themes were used within the homes and were based on plant and animal life that were seen in nature and seen in their surroundings. One theme often seen incorporated the Egyptians' enemies painted on the floor so that they could walk over them. Vertical movement was encouraged with the use of color. The softest colors were used on the floor, getting brighter and brighter as they went up towards the ceiling. Walls would be decorated with paintings or reliefs, and they would actually hang mats or rugs, similar to what we think of as wall tapestries on the walls. Walls were, again, divided into 3 parts from floor to ceiling. Dado was the lowest part of the wall, then the main field, and then the frieze. On the main field was where Egyptian would paint figures. They did not understand perspective, so things were painted in 2D, with the body facing forward and the face turned to one side. When looking at their furniture, the types of wood available in Egypt only allow for short pieces to be used together, so the Egyptians had to create several types of joinery methods to connect all the pieces together. The scarf joint joins 2 pieces of wood at the end grain by providing a center block, similar to a dowel, between the 2 to hold them together. There were other joints created like the dowel, mortise and tenon. There's a variety of joinery methods found depicted in imagery. Wood was the primary material for furniture. Leather was also used or incorporated into furniture pieces. Furniture would be inlaid with gold and silver. Designs might also include prominent marquetry or representational design. There was also parquetry, which is inclusion of geometric design. So if you think about parquet flooring, right, it's a geometric pattern created on the floor. That might help you kind of remember the difference between marquetry and parquetry. The Egyptian seating included both stools and seats. Stools were the earliest type of seat and were used by all levels of social class. Many different styles of stools were created, like lattice stool, which was the most popular, as well as a folding stool, which is kind of shaped like an X. They might have round legs. Oftentimes they included animal legs into stools and different seating. Chairs were a status symbol, typically used for nobility, although later on they became more available to lower class or regular people. The chair was first created by adding a back to a stool. So the first chair that you see symbolized would have a perfectly vertical or straight back, although later we see them inclined to be more comfortable. Inlay with metals and gems were common, especially with more prominent or wealthy class people and their chairs. Royalty had very expensive materials that they could have and incorporate into their seating. Certain characteristics allow us to recognize that the furniture is Egyptian. This includes animal feet. Animals creating either the arms or the end pieces of furniture is something that's very prominently recognized as Egyptian. Pharaohs included this a lot in their design. Looking at the beds, there were many variations, but had some similarities, including the frame that had side rails and were rounded. It might be dipped in the center. Footboards were something that were oftentimes included as well, and they would be a decorative part of the bed. It was common to divide it into 3 sections. Beds also were supported by carved legs and animal feet. Certain characteristics in the ornamentation allow us to recognize that furniture is Egyptian. Again, the use of animal feet, animals creating the arms and end pieces of furniture, the use of papyrus plants, lotus leaves, palm leaves, sphinx, spirals, guilloche, wave patterns, scarabs, sun discs, serpents, human figures, and gods. All these different symbols included help us recognize when something is Egyptian. Persians eventually conquer Babylon, and the Mesopotamian empires no longer exist. But we still continue to see advances in science, social order, agriculture, and architecture spread throughout this Mediterranean region. This is going to lead us into our next chapter with the Minoan, Mycenaean, and Greek design and their influences.